Ever since the game was first announced, The Elder Scrolls Online has been pulled in two directions. On one hand, we've got the ravenous MMO crowd who's just looking for the next leveling experience to blitz through and the next endgame to criticize. On the other hand, we've got the single-player Elder Scrolls crowd who wants another immersive experience that they can dive into. Now, both these camps are difficult to please in and of themselves, and pleasing both of them in a single game is, well, a monumental task. My name is Force, and here in this video we'll be taking a look at some of the things The Elder Scrolls Online are trying to do to please both camps, and how some may work and others may fail. Alright guys, so what we're going to be doing here in this video is just going through a bullet point list of some of the different ways I feel like The Elder Scrolls Online is trying to please both camps, and I'd like to not only give you my opinions and views on the matter, but also like to hear what you guys have to think. I also want to put out a disclaimer that any gameplay experience that I have with this game is coming from playtests that were done at events. Now, because there is a beta that's under an NDA, I cannot speak to my beta experience, but I do have experience with the game outside of the beta where no NDA is applied. So now that that's out of the way, let's jump right in. The first thing I like to talk about is perspective. Now, The Elder Scrolls Online was initially designed with third-person perspective in mind. And if you would argue that fact, you need to simply go to interviews that were done just earlier this year in which they said that very thing. And they said that, yes, there is a single-player view, but there are no combat animations, there's no weapon swings and casting that would be available because the game was not designed with that in mind. Now, what happened was after those interviews went live, there was a big uproar from the single-player crowd, the people who are used to playing an Elder Scrolls game in the first-person perspective. Now, the difference is that in an MMO, you deal with things like enemy players and respawns, and that's something you don't have to consider in a single-player Elder Scrolls game. The single-player Elder Scrolls games have always been designed with that first person in mind as the primary play mode. And so you look at things like dungeons that have rather linear paths, and you're always encountering enemies in front of you. Very, very rarely is it the case that an enemy is going to be behind you just because, again, it's not designed that way. You don't have to deal with people respawning from behind you. So with that in mind, that's why they decided to initially build this game in a third-person perspective, but because the community said, hey, we've always played Elder Scrolls games in first person, I want to play this one in first person, they went in and added it. Something they just added this year. They had original prototypes from way back when, but it wasn't even initially considered for the game. Now, while some will say that's amazing that they actually did that, it's also a little bit of a cause for concern because you wonder if this wasn't in their initial mindset when they were designing the game, how good is that first-person perspective really going to be? And that's a tough call. I mean, again, with the beta under an NDA, the most experienced people have with this, they can't talk about at the moment, but people got to look at the first-person perspective at QuakeCon, and there was an overwhelming sort of sense of disapproval of the way the combat animations looked. Now, this is something that they could certainly improve over time, and once that stuff it becomes talkable, then we can talk onto those issues. But first-person perspective is a rather new concession that they're making between the MMO experience in third person and the first-person experience from traditional Elder Scrolls games. Now, also along the lines of perspective, we can talk about combat. So combat in this game is pretty interesting. Now, when you're dealing with online games, and I'm not going to go too into depth here, but when dealing with online games, you also have to always consider latency and the fact that there's communication between a person's computer, the game server, and then back to the person's computer. And because you can't guarantee good internet connections across your entire player base, concessions are typically made. So traditional single-player Elder Scrolls games, we have got, some people would argue this, but I would say a pretty visceral combat system in the sense that you're swinging back your sword and you're hitting enemies and you need to physically hit their bodies to connect. Well, in this game, that is not the case. As long as you're within a certain distance, even if your weapon does not hit the enemy player, it's still going to connect as long as you're within that what's considered the melee distance of the game. This is pretty standard in a lot of MMOs, the tab targeting MMOs or the soft lock MMOs. Now, while there are games that do have that physical connection, they do suffer dearly for people who have poor internet connections, and those games are almost unplayable for that crowd. And so when you have a massive audience and you've got a lot of people in a single area at once, accounting for that is important. So for that reason, combat in the Elder Scrolls Online is going to feel much different than it does for single player, people who are used to the single player experience, though they are trying to go for a balancing act. There is a left mouse button for swinging, and then you can hold it down to charge up an attack. There's right mouse button for blocking, and then there are also hotkeys like 1 through 5 for your different spells and abilities. But it isn't going to be as connecting dependent when it comes to melee attacks, or especially things like ranged attacks where you're not really aiming for body parts, you're just aiming at a target, and as long as you're within the vicinity, it's going to hit. It's definitely going to be a much different experience for people who are used to that single player Elder Scrolls combat. Now, while it has seemed all doom and gloom for people who are used to the single-player experience so far, the next big point is voice acting, and I think this is something that traditional Elder Scrolls players are absolutely going to love. Now, it's a monumental task to try to completely voice act your game, but it is something that ZeniMax is doing with the Elder Scrolls Online. They will have voice acting for every NPC that you collect a quest from. That is a big thing, and I think that's something that can't be understated. Yes, it's been done in the past. BioWare did it, and EA did it with Star Wars: The Old Republic, but that doesn't mean that it's not a big deal. It is a very big deal. It is very time-consuming. It cost a lot of money, a lot of development money that could be placed into other areas of a game. But they wanted to keep this immersive world. They wanted to keep true for the single-player fans, and so they do have full voice acting in this game. It's a big deal. It shouldn't be understated, and hopefully it's appreciated by the people who really care about it, because I can tell you that a lot of hardcore MMO players are just going to skip through all of it. In fact, mostly, I'll probably skip through all of it. Now, what about, if we're talking about the single player fans, what about the interactivity of the world? What about your ability to manifest change in the environment around you? Well, there is a sort of a balance that is struck here as well. There are certain areas within the Elder Scrolls Online where you can pick up things off tables, but there's also plenty of stuff that will be glued down. It is not the case that you can pick up every goblet and every sweet roll that you see on a table, or every soul shard that you see within the world. Only certain ones actually have that interactivity, and only certain books on the bookshelf can be read and picked up. This isn't a fully physics-based game where you can pick stuff up, drop it, and throw it around. That sort of physics in an MMORPG, to my knowledge, hasn't been done on a grand scale, at least not successfully. I can't think of any big MMO that has that sort of crazy physics where you can pick up a barrel and toss it across the room and watch it bounce. Those are calculations that are very difficult to be done when they're not done on the client side and they're done on the server side, and that's how MMOs are, to prevent cheating, the server side reliability. But yeah, that sort of crazy interactivity and that sort of physics-based is not what you're seeing in this game, because it's a difficult technical task and it probably costs boatloads more money than they've already spent on this title. But there is still some interactivity. You can still read some books and you can still pick up some objects. And the last major thing I'd like to talk about here is the leveling experience and the fact that it is going to be tailored to a solo playstyle. And this is again something that I think the single player fans will really like. The MMO fans might be a little more frustrated by, but there's opportunities for both areas, for both people to be happy. So first of all, the majority of the single player experience will be able to be done solo. You can do it completely by yourself, just like you did in traditional Elder Scrolls games. But there are also things like 4-player dungeons where you can group up with other people, and there will certainly be other people within the environments that you're going through that you can decide to group up with as well. Now, when it comes to the end game, once again, they're trying to please both camps. We've got 50+ zones, which are besides your alliance's zone that you level through, you're going to be able to go into the enemy alliance zones and do PvE content, and you can do this by yourself or with a small group of people, depending on how you like to approach it. Then there will be 4-player dungeons, which is a little bit more of a step up in the social sense. Then there's supposed to be adventure zones eventually added to the game, which will be large-scale PvE. And then there's the large-scale PvP that's taking place within the center of Cyrodiil. So again, if you're playing by yourself, you've got plenty of content beyond your leveling experience once you hit level cap, and if you like to play with a small or a large group of people, there are going to be options for you there as well. So in summary, when we look at some key aspects of the game, such as the game's perspective, the game's combat, voice acting, an interactive world, and the leveling experience, whether it be solo or group, it's quite obvious that the innate design of this game is always trying to be this balancing act between a single player experience and an MMORPG. And it'll be very interesting to see how both of those camps respond to this game. It could very well be the case that we've got the hardcore MMORPG players. They're going to jump in, they're going to play for a couple of months, they'll grind to end game. Maybe they'll like it, maybe they won't. If they don't, they leave. If they do, they stay. And then we've got the single player fans, which might approach this as, hey, this is like just a sort of a watered down Elder Scrolls experience. But hopefully both these camps can sort of find something that they enjoy from the game, because I can tell you once again from my prior play experience with it, it seems like something that could certainly be quite immersive for people who maybe aren't traditionally into that, and quite social for people who aren't into that either. So again, it'll be a rather interesting, I guess if nothing else, this is going to be an interesting case study when two worlds collide, if you will. So please let me know, guys, what you think below about what we talked about here today, about the Elder Scrolls Online, about the concessions they're making for the better and worse for both camps of the single player and multiplayer fans. And yeah, let me know if this is a game that you think you'll be excited from and what camp that you are in. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. And as always, keep watching and keep owning.